This is an interview for the Industrial Relations Society of New South Wales Oral History Project. The interviewee is Peter Lawson and I'm the interviewer, Judy Hughes. The date is the 10th of December 2021. Welcome, Peter.
Good morning, Judy. Nice to see you again.
Can we start with your early influences in life, where you're from and a bit about your family background?
Sure. I grew up in the eastern suburbs of Sydney. I went to school in both the public and the private sector system. My family were involved in heavy engineering, being shipping repairs and engineering and rebuilds. As a consequence of that, I sort of was exposed to, I guess, the world of blue-collar work early in my youth, and spent some school holidays sort of working in and around the factory, which is in Sussex Street on the famous Golden Mile, the Hungry Mile, I mean, in Sydney. So I left school and did science applied psychology at New South Wales Uni. I wasn't a very good scientist, but I loved psychology. And with those studies behind me, that got me into my first real job in employment and industrial relations with the Anglis Group, international meat and food processing company. With them I worked in Riverstone on the outskirts of Sydney for 18 months. I was transferred to Melbourne for 5 weeks to replace a fellow who went on long service leave. He resigned. I stayed in Melbourne for 3.5 years. And I think that was probably the making of my enlightenment into the world of employee relations and industrial relations.
Did you become interested in industrial relations at university as well?
Not especially, no, not at all. No, I love the psychology, the science of human behaviour, and I think once I started work, that sort of brought out that interest in me, seeing people at work, hard, tough, and at times very dirty work in the meat and food processing industries, and how people reacted to those working conditions. And I guess from that point on, I had an interest in ensuring that what I saw and what I contributed added to the benefit of everybody, including my employer and the employees and the representatives.
So at what point did you think, well, this is what I really want to do, I'm going to keep with industrial relations?
I don't think there was a twilight moment that brought that on. I think it evolved. It certainly evolved even more when I was transferred to Melbourne. And as I mentioned before, to fill in for a fellow for 5 weeks, he resigned on long service leave and I stayed 3.5 years. I guess in one way that was the making of me as an individual. And I was living away from home for that period of time in my early 20s. My dad died whilst I was working in Melbourne. He died at age 50. So once again, that brought another dimension to my life and my family's life. But no, I guess I learnt all of the fundamental issues related to people at work and families at work, because there was a high migrant intake of employees in the meat and food processing industries in the western suburbs of Melbourne in the early and mid-1960s. It was an enlightening time for me.
And what did that work involve?
Both as an employment officer, recruiting a lot of employees, particularly there's a daily pickup of casual employees, because the workforce, you never had 100% work. High migrant intake, of course, and the work site itself was almost like a little United Nations, and at times we had to be very sensitive to the different nationalities, how well they worked together, or whether they should even be placed together. That was, you're always, not always, but at times you're walking on broken glass to keep the peace. I was involved on a daily basis with employees and their issues at work, with their representatives, with their unions, both individually as employees and collectively as employees, again with their unions. So I guess I was involved in that industrial relations atmosphere from a fairly early time, And that was just continuing on basically for the rest of my working life in one way or the other.
And where did your career go after that?
I was then recruited into the Broken Hill mining industry, which is, and that was a complete eye-opener to me. I went there as a very young man. I was appointed personnel manager of one of 4 operating underground metalliferous mines. I learnt, I guess, the collegiate system of employee relations there more than anywhere else leading up to that point in time. Up to that point in time, a lot of the industrial relations had been very adversarial. But in Broken Hill, there was no independent third party down the road. You had to resolve your own industrial disputes. Everyone was focused on doing that. We didn't have awards. We had an industry-wide agreement, a single industry-wide agreement which covered 4 operating underground mines and 2 power stations. It was a hard working environment for men, and it was 98% men working underground. It was a tough world, and that was a town of 29,000 people. And one of the enduring thoughts about that in terms of demographics, the 29,000 people, 27 pubs and 12 clubs. So it was an outback city, desert. So you actually had to make your own fun, you had to make your own life within this city of 29,000 people. I was married just before I went to Broken Hill. We had 2 daughters whilst living in Broken Hill for that 10 years. So I think they're both very proud that they were born in Broken Hill. I think that's certainly on their passports that I was seeing. But we made our own fun as well as hard work, constant interpersonal relationships with the workforce and with the community. Broken Hill City Council, for instance, the mining industry in those days recruited and had a workforce of about 4,500, and that had a knock-on effect in the community of about 3.5 to 1, a multiplier. So about 14,000 jobs out of a community of 29,000 people were dependent upon those 4 operating mines continuing. And of course, everything to do with the civic structure and the infrastructure around the town was there to support the industry and the workers and their families, with schools, shops, churches, you name it. In one way or other, the mining companies were expected to contribute a lot outside just the day-to-day mining industry. I sailed there for 10 years. Surprise, surprise, I'm a lifelong sailor. But it's not everybody that drives, in those days, 70 miles or 100 k's to go sailing. But that whole 10 years I lived there, I sailed every fortnight for about 8 months of the year. And we had a family caravan at the lakeside where the boats were kept. So, and every community interest group and sporting group you could imagine lived and thrived within that township. It was a great place to live.
And so what happened with your career after that?
I was recruited into CSR at a time when CSR had purchased 5 coal mines in Queensland with the Tees Group. And CSR, being the traditional Australian sugar and building materials company, as it was in those days, took this venture into coal mining. They had a couple of small operating mines, one small uranium mine and another small copper mine in South Australia, but really had no people with mining or resources experience. So I was one of a wave of about 200 mining and resource experienced people that joined CSR at a time of huge expansion in its business. So I was in the corporate headquarters providing industrial and community structures, advice through internal consulting groups, and also directly to the operating mines and other structures around, and development mines. So that was pretty interesting. I played a fairly major role in the then Australian Coal Association as CSR's representative. And at that point in time, we were about the 2nd largest coal mining company in Australia behind BHP. So that led me to, I guess, meeting most industry executives in mining and resources in Australia. I travelled a lot around the country. It was a rewarding time, but at the same time CSR had overextended itself. About 4 years after I started, they purchased a big oil company in South Australia. Then all of a sudden interest rates changed and a $900 million investment became a $1.4 billion debt, and CSR all of a sudden had to contract. So having been on this wave of 200 professionals coming in, I was then on the end of one of those Dear John letters, which I had to write to myself on my way out in 1986. I was appointed Director of Industrial Relations at the Chamber of Manufacturers of New South Wales, which was the second largest employer group in New South Wales at the time, beside the Employers Federation. And that led to, I guess, dealing with people at a different level, mainly owners of businesses and captains of industry, a lot of government liaison, as well as providing a whole range of industrial advisory services by the people that work with me and my team. And I witnessed at that time a merger of the Chamber of Manufacture of New South Wales with the Victorian Chamber, and it became known as the Australian Chamber of Manufacturers. Having been introduced to some of those so-called captains of industry and pollies and senior public servants, I was then literally headhunted by the Greiner government out of the private sector. I was one of 6, in 1988, I was one of 6 private sector experienced personnel to join the New South Wales public sector, and I joined as Secretary and Chief Executive of the Department of Industrial Relations and Employment in New South Wales.
And you would have seen some change in industrial relations during that time?
Oh, quite dramatic change, yes. There was a much more of a surge in enterprise-focused agreements, less reliance upon awards. A new government in New South Wales replaced, I replaced a chief executive that had had one minister and one department for 12 years. So it was a bit like turning the tanker around. It took a long time for people to realise that there is a new government, there's a new chief executive, and we've got work to do.
And what did you try to bring to that role?
I guess my experience from the private sector, as well as, yes, just practical, down-to-earth experience as an industrial relations and employee relations practitioner. That led me to fairly close brushes with senior public servants and politicians. My minister of the day, who was very enthusiastic in recruiting me, even though I was recruited by the Premier's department, he endorsed my appointment. Regrettably, we never quite consummated my contracts of employment. I have the 5 drafts of my contract of employment, which the minister at no stage got around to signing. But what I experienced then was how politicians then interfere with the workings of a state government department. Both the politicians personally and their ministerial advisors, who basically interfere in the role between the public servants in the department and the minister, who has to carry the responsibility for the policy, both the policy development within the department and the policy implementation via departmental officers. I had a $120 million budget, 1,200 employees, spread over 42 different offices throughout New South Wales. And everybody still referred to it as the old DLI, the Department of Labour and Industry, because it was a regulator department and was spread all over the state. But after a couple of years, I found myself at loggerheads with the minister. I was asked to do things which I thought were quite inappropriate, an inappropriate use of public funds. And then when I was directed to deploy departmental funds for party political purposes, and I refused, and then the minister wanted me to appoint one of his ministerial advisors as a deputy secretary to myself, for which there was no budget. And he was the one that approved the budget only a couple of months beforehand, and I refused to do that. We were on the path of parting ways. And at one point, there was a Herald released an article one morning, but the Department of Industrial Relations and Employment was about to undergo a major reshuffle of its staff, a reorganisation. I rang the minister and I said, "Did you release this?" There's just a silence on the end of the phone. I said, "Well, you've indicated that my position is also up for grabs, as well as the organisation that I've just put in place with your approval, and now you want to change all that. It seems that you want to run the department, so I'll take leave this afternoon." And at 5 o'clock that afternoon, I left the Department of Industrial Relations and Employment, which led to a very interesting standoff between the Premier's department and myself. And in the end, we negotiated an exit package. Simple as that. So that was certainly, that was the most daunting, the most challenging and the most exhilarating job I think I've ever had. That nearly 2 years as head of a government department. And within 3 months, a government of another political persuasion appointed me to the Industrial Relations Commission. So in February 1990, I was appointed as a Commissioner of the Australian Industrial Relations Commission, and that became the next 19 years of my career until I retired in January 2009.
Can you say what those things were that you didn't want, that you thought were party political, that you didn't want to spend department funds on?
No, I don't think I should share that. No. I think that's probably something that rests between the minister and myself, and he's no longer around. So.
Okay. So,
but I guess the worst component was directing me to appoint one of his ministerial advisors as a deputy secretary of the department. No budget, no allocation, no duties that I was aware of. I just spent a couple of $100,000 working with consultants, reorganising the structures of the department to keep them working, consistent with what the government's new policy agenda was. So
who approached you about the commission appointment? How did you hear about that?
I was approached by the then Secretary of the Commonwealth Department of Industrial Relations. There was a Department of Industrial Relations in those days. He was a fellow who I had worked with off and on then for about 4 years all up, both through the Chamber of Manufacturers, the Australian Chamber, and as head of the Department of DIRE in New South Wales. He approached me and said, "The Minister wishes to make 2 appointments to the Industrial Relations Commission. Is it something you've ever thought of? Are you interested? You have 48 hours in which to consider that and come back to me, accepting the fact that you'll have to have an ASIO check and an ATO check." I didn't have anything to hide, so I accepted the offer, and I was appointed by Minister Peter Morris. In those days, he was Minister for Industrial Relations in the Commonwealth Government. Took up my appointment in February 1990.
And when did you first join the Industrial Relations Society?
We have to backtrack now, back to 1965, Judy. When I first went to Melbourne in 1965, I worked with a fellow, he was my boss, and he was a very enthusiastic member of the Industrial Relations Society of Victoria. And I can't recall whether it was monthly or bi-monthly, there would be these meetings that he would take me along to, and I'd meet all manner of people, academics, industrial relations academics, law academics, unionists, union officials, other employers that I was aware of but I hadn't met, and consultants. And once again, this was, I guess, my first introduction to how broad the membership is of the IRS. So I became a fairly enthusiastic member of the IRSOV for 3.5 years. That membership just was put on hold when I first went to Broken Hill, but then I transferred my membership once I was settled in Broken Hill. I transferred my membership then from the IRS of Victoria to the IRS of New South Wales, and I've basically been involved with them ever since.
Are there any big events that you remember in your time with the IRS? Any big conferences or?
Well, I was a member of the organising committee for the 1992 International Industrial Relations Association Congress in Sydney. That was 2 years of work. John Nyland was the chair of that organising committee, and Tim Moore. Tim Moore was the secretary of it. One of my CSR colleagues, Vernon Winley, was involved in it. So that was sort of something that we all worked on very hard for a couple of years to make sure that when 960 odd delegates arrived in Sydney in September 1992, we put on our version of the Olympic Games of Industrial Relations. So it was great.
And do you think the IRS has changed over the years?
Oh yes. Well, the cross-section of membership has changed. I think nowadays what I see is, what I view now is less number of practitioners, if I can describe them that way, people that have learnt their employee relations and industrial relations effectively on the job. It's become far more legalistic. I put that down to the introduction of work choices, which turned the whole industrial relations world on its head, which was the intention of the Howard government at the time to do it. And it produced the most god-awful legislation I've ever had to deal with. And I've dealt with a fair bit over the years in all different positions.
Awful in what sense?
Highly complex, direct intention to diminish the role and influence of unions, the introduction of individual contracts and enterprise agreements, the diminishing of awards, the role of awards, the diminishing of the powers of the Industrial Relations Commission. One of the great impacts and one of the great effects of the Industrial Relations Commission under the previous legislation before work choices was there was a clear and understood arbitral power. You very, very rarely used it as a member of the Commission. So there's the big bat in the corner of the room, and it could be used if it had to be used. It was very, very rarely used. It gathered dust most of the time. The bat was taken away. As a consequence of that, you had parties showing less respect for the institution. Some parties were emboldened by the new legislation that gave particularly individual employers and small employer groups much more power than they'd had before. There's a whole branch of lawyers, or how can I describe them? Not as a gaggle of lawyers, but it became a highly legalistic process to get anything into and out of the Industrial Relations Commission, which was anti to the way it had worked and worked successfully for 80 odd years at that stage. So, but Howard achieved his aim. The work choices was created by, as I understand, 8 or 10 different law firms providing one of their expert lawyers to write a section of work choices. And for a practitioner, for someone who had to implement the legislation, it was like you had a bunch of silos of all different issues in employment relationships. And if you stayed in the silo, you're fine. But if you wanted to move across, it was very difficult. The legislation was complex. I think it was 1,400 odd pages in an A5 bound book. And in my view, about 70 pages of that legislation was useful for me as a member of the Commission. I could use those to help conciliate, mediate and resolve industrial disputes one way or the other.
And we're just nearing the end of our time. Can you say is industrial relations still a good career for a young person, do you think?
Oh, well, of course. You'll always have people working. You'll always have the providers of capital and the providers of labour. I guess forever and a day they will re-image themselves however, but there's an inherent conflict in that relationship, and that relationship has to be managed. And it has to be managed by competent, skilled and very experienced people.
That's great. Is there anything that you want to talk about that we haven't covered today?
I had life membership of the IRS of New South Wales conferred on me. I was a member of the committee from 1985 for the next 16 years, holding I think every position apart from Secretary of the IRS of New South Wales. And at the end of 16 years, I was a great believer of the old guard moving aside and letting the new guard have a go. So I think I stayed on as an immediate past president for a year. And I think it was at the end of that year or the year after, I had life membership conferred on me, and that was given to me by Michael Kirby of all people, who was our guest of honour at a convention that we had at the entrance at that year. So yes, I'm one of a privileged few life members of the IRS of New South Wales. It's a great honour, and those who know me have heard me sort of speak about it often.
That's great. Thanks so much, Peter.
All right. Well, I hope you make something out of that, Judy.